Let's examine what is a military rapier and review the Chen Saxony rapier. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this rapier was kindly gifted to me and the channel by a benefactor, and it's from Chen. It's the Saxony rapier. There's a link below to the product. It comes in at $500 currently on the Chen website. Obviously, the price might vary slightly if you buy through sort of secondary resellers. Right, so I've had this sword for a while and I've featured it in a number of videos. You've even seen me cutting with it if you've been eagle-eyed as well. Now, the first thing I want to get off the table at the beginning of this is that not all rapiers are equal. A rapier is a very vague term and applies to a wide group of usually complex hilted swords that are more or less thrust-centric. I have a small collection of original rapiers behind me, 16th, 17th century rapiers, I think pretty much all 17th century actually. And the blades all vary on them. I've done videos about this in the past. The widths, the lengths, the weights, the stiffness, it all varies. So making general statements about what a rapier can or can't do doesn't really work a lot of the time. And the term rapier itself is also problematic because what meant rapier in one place at one time might be different to what it meant to a different person in a different place at a different time. So this, in the grand scheme of things, is quite a cutty or choppy rapier. What do I mean by that? Well, if I draw this out here, we will look at this in some larger space in a minute, but you can see it's a relatively broad blade. So while Chen has made this, called this a rapier, and I think most people probably would call it a rapier, this is a blade which is as broad and as cut-worthy, if that's not even a term, but as able to cut as pretty much some types of, certainly lots of side sword and even certain types of medieval arming sword and later periods of sabre and things like this, certainly spadroons and stuff. So this is what I would call a cut and thrust rapier, which most rapiers are, but not all. Some of them basically can only thrust, they don't have any cutting capacity at all. This one has quite a lot of cutting capacity, and if we draw a spectrum of what a rapier is, this is further up the cutty end of the scale rather than the thrusty end of the scale. It's not even in the middle, it's further up towards the cutty end of the scale. That dictates how this handles, and it also dictates how I assess it and judge it. And some people might term this a military rapier. Rapiers weren't just civilian swords, they were carried in military life. By various types of soldier, mostly officers, on horseback and on foot, and this is the type of rapier that could have been taken to war in the early 1600s. So before I go into more detail, for those of you who don't want to watch the entire video, I'm going to give a brief summary of my view of this rapier, having had it for a while, having thought about it, looked at it, handled it, and also having cut with it on various targets. My basic assessment of this rapier is that it is a good choice for the money. For $500, I think it is a relatively high-end rapier replica. That being said, there's quite a number of things that I personally don't like about it very much. Overall, I would say the blade is really, really good. It has taken a very slight set during one of the cutting tests I did. Not really enough to affect its performance, and I can probably remove it, but I haven't done for now. And I thought I should mention that to manage expectations and also for complete transparency, that absolutely one of my cuts on a thin piece of green wood, the blade obviously twisted slightly in the cut. I didn't notice at the time, but I noticed afterwards the blade had taken a very, very slight set. So there are different steel options available from Chen, but just to be aware of that, these things aren't indestructible and things can happen to them. The other thing that I would mention as well is during cutting, there has developed a very slight amount of looseness in the hilt, particularly the guard. Okay, so the guard now has a very slight rattle when you hit it on things, and that's through a relatively minimum amount of cutting. Now, some of you might at that point immediately write this off and say, well, that's a quality control issue, and I sort of agree. Okay, so that kind of saddened me and disappointed me slightly. I don't think that necessarily should have happened. Right, aesthetically, I've said I love the blade. I think the blade's very well made, performs very well. It's very sharp out of the box. It's a great choice for a cutting sword if you want to add a rapier to your cutting sword collection. Other things I don't like, I'm not hugely at all a fan of the finish on the hilt, although I understand that LK Chen may have changed that now. So this kind of frosted, kind of matte finish to the guard and the pommel, in my opinion, have the look of a modern sort of almost like a bathroom kind of furniture, like taps and knobs, faucets if you call them that. So they don't look quite right. So I think either blackened or either shiny, they would look better than they currently do in this weird sort of kind of satin finish. Another thing I don't particularly like about this is that I believe this is a screw-on pommel, and that is a purely decorative nut or peen block at the end there, and I would personally prefer if the tang went fully through to the end and was actually peened, or if that was a functional nut, or some other form of construction whereby the tang went fully through the end. As I understand it, the tang disappears somewhere into the pommel and the pommel is screwed on and glue is applied to the whole hilt construction in my experience. The problem with that is when you start using these swords either in fencing or in cutting in the case of a sharp one, the vibrations make the glue break down and they introduce rattles, and it's very difficult to correct them, to remedy those with this type of construction where the grip is glued onto the tang, and trying to tighten it up here won't necessarily do anything, or at least not very easily. So I'm not a huge fan of the hilt assembly method. So here we are with a little bit more space. I'll dispense with the scabbard now. Let's just talk about the handling, the movement of the sword. It is fantastic, and that is something that we've seen time and again that LK Chen really gets, really understands. LK Chen is fantastic, if we have like a tick box list, fantastic at edge geometry, at producing well-performing or good-performing cutting swords, at the general form and geometry of blades, and at creating swords of any type, whether it's Chinese, European, whatever, that handle really, really well. Now, I should mention that this sword is based on a sword apparently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a German rapier. Now, I've been through the Metropolitan Museum of Art's online catalogue and I can't actually find the sword that this is based on. I can find a couple of swords which share similar features, and indeed they are both German. And this style of pommel, in fact, is generally found on German swords as far as I've seen, or at least German hilts. Sometimes they might be imported Spanish or Italian blades. Equally, you find imported German blades on Spanish and Italian hilts. So there was lots of trade going on in hilts and blades in the 17th century. And it probably dates to about 1620. So it's difficult for me to directly say whether this is faithful or close to an original sword, because I don't have the stats for the original sword. So obviously you know that I work with the Royal Armouries and the Windlass line, so in that regards I can tell you at least approximately how close certain swords are to things in the Royal Armouries if I'm familiar with them. I can't tell you in the case of this Metropolitan Museum of Art sword, because I can't find the exact sword that this is based on, and I don't have, even if I had a picture of it, I don't have the statistics and measurements of it. But purely speaking, as someone who is familiar with original 17th century swords, both in my own collection and in museum collections, and in fact I was at the Royal Armouries yesterday holding several, I would say that this is a good, in terms of handling, a really good analogue for a 17th century military cut and thrust rapier. However, I suspect, and I say again, I can't say categorically because I don't have measurements, I suspect that the hilt might be a little bit on the large side. Now, from product development myself, I know sometimes this is an executive decision to slightly enlarge a hilt if original antique hilts seem a bit too small for modern users and their preferences, and I get that. Sometimes basket hilts are very confined. Sometimes swept hilts are quite confined, and original antique rapiers sometimes have smaller hilts, therefore, than modern replica rapiers. So I don't know. I can't say because I don't know which sword this is based on, but just in general, this is quite big for a rapier hilt. You will notice if you just look at the length of the grip there, with just putting one finger, not even two fingers, just putting one finger over the guard, I still have quite a lot of grip sticking out of the end. If I hold it entirely in the hand, that is about the right length, but that's not normally, although you can hold a rapier like that, and some people at some treatises actually recommend holding it like that. Generally, rapiers were held with at least one finger over the quillon or guard. So to me, and also looking at the width of the guard, it seems just a little bit on the wide side for a swept hilt. So I don't know. There are some original ones that are large, so I don't know. It's possible that this does exactly match the measurements of the Metropolitan Museum of Art example, but I don't know if this was based purely on photographs of that Met example, or if it was based on actual measurements of the Met example. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But based on my experience of lots of rapiers over the years, the hilt seems a little bit on the large side. Not massively so, just a little bit. Still within historical parameters, but a little bit big. I would also say, generally speaking, the blade is certainly broader than most rapiers as we commonly perceive them are. Okay, so if what you want is a really typical rapier, this is probably not a typical rapier. This is a broader than average rapier that cuts better than an average rapier, therefore, and has a slightly bigger hilt than an average rapier. But all of those things being said, it does handle absolutely fantastically. Now, I don't want to be overly critical of this point, but this is also this example is slightly heavier than the one listed on their website, which I think is about 1,380 grams. I've just weighed this one on my very precise scales, and it is 1410. So this is 1410 grams. That's fairly heavy. It's not crazy heavy for a rapier, but it's fairly heavy. And that corresponds to the fact that we've got a rapier here which is broader than a typical rapier and also has a slightly larger hilt than a typical rapier. So this, I think, putting all of this information together, broader blade than average, bigger hilt than average, slightly heavier than average, what we can call this is a beefy military rapier. That's how I'd vaguely describe it. It's the sort of rapier that someone might use in the cavalry in the sort of first quarter or second quarter of the 1600s. So let's say between about 1610 and about 1640. Now I'm going to try and do a concise review of the actual product itself just as a sword. Okay? Sharpness and edge geometry are absolutely fantastic. It has a very slight hollow grind and it's beautifully executed. The flex, the distal taper, which is obviously relates to the flex, is all pretty much in the second half of the blade. We've got a nice thick blade at the base here, a lot of distal taper, and where it flexes is entirely in the second half of the blade. Absolutely fantastic. So great edge geometry, great edge, great hollow grinding, great distal taper, and these all contribute to how it handles, of course. And I would say also the plunge grinds down here are very nicely and evenly and tidily executed. My only slight criticism around the blade, I love the blade in general, but my only slight criticism is that the edges are somewhat angular, and this leads to stress points, stress risers. So where the ricasso comes up and cuts a right angle just above the guard there, the corners are rather abrupt. I'd rather see them slightly rounded to reduce stress, and I think if you do stress this blade to the max, that is going to be a breaking point risk across there, and those corners should be rounded. On a slightly related topic, I would also say that this ricasso corners are not quite as rounded as they should be. Remember that the ricasso on a rapier is there to interact with your hand. Sometimes your thumb is going to be up on one side, sometimes your index fingers, or sometimes even two index fingers, are going to be around the front. So it's really important that this interaction point with your hand, this ricasso in here, has nice rounded edges and is smoothed off. I'm not saying it's sharp, it's not, but I think with prolonged use and prolonged cutting, that kind of corner needs to be a little bit more rounded. Now, in terms of the grip, I have to say a massive positive and also a slight negative. So the grip is beautifully done and the wire wrap is really, really good. They've used very fine wire. They've done Turk's heads, and I actually remember LK contacted me probably a couple of years ago, I think, when they were working on these swords, asking me questions about Turk's heads. So LK takes this stuff very, very seriously and does the research. And these Turk's heads have been executed that's the essentially braided wire at top and bottom, very, very well, and have the look of originals. And the wire is thin. Some people use overly thick wire. They've used really thin wire, really, really good. My criticisms are twofold. Firstly, the wire, I would say, is slightly too shiny. I don't know what it's made of. I don't think it's certainly not silver. It's some kind of alloy, I would imagine, stainless steel, something like that. And it just looks a little bit too silvery, but it doesn't quite look like silver. So I would personally prefer a darker wire. I don't know, there's various ways of achieving that. But that being said, it's very, very well done. And you've got this twist, as well as the twist wire, you've got the twist up the grip. It's beautifully done. One minor thing, unfortunately, which I think would annoy a lot of people, is this Turk's head at the bottom. One of the ends of the wire is just sticking out and has left a sharp bit. Now that's easily remedied, even just with a pocket knife or a piece of wood or your fingernail possibly even. But at the moment it's sticking out. If you wear a glove, you wouldn't notice it. But with bare hands, I have got a sharp bit of wire sticking out there. But that being said, the grip is a nice size. It's nice and narrow. It's not overly large. It doesn't have any particular shape to it, but a lot of rapier grips don't. So very, very nicely done. Now, onto the guard itself. I would say it is very obviously made with modern manufacturing. This is cast guard. You can see it looks almost like 3D printed. You can see there is no welding here. There's no forge welds or arc welds. It is clearly cast. And that is also true of the pommel in this case. Not all of LK Chen's pommels are. Some of them are actually milled or lathed, I think. But anyway, this is clearly cast. This is clearly cast. And I'm not massively against that. Other companies, I mean, I think Albion cast their hilt parts, but then they treat them subsequently after they've cast them in such a way with their polishing or grinding that makes them look like they're handmade or more like they're handmade. In LK's case, LK Chen's case, this still looks like a cast guard, and a lot of that is because of the finish, because of this satin matte finish, which, as I've said, I'm not a fan of. But also the other giveaways, when we look at the details around here, they just don't have the look of something which has been made with hand filing in the way that these would have been made originally. They look like something that's come out of a mould, which they have. Okay, and what I would also say, I can feel this while I'm handling it, this guard now wiggles slightly laterally from side to side from cutting. Okay, and that's not really acceptable. So there is a constructional issue there, and I think that could be remedied with constructing the hilt in a different way, having the tang come through to the end and having a nut, so that at least if something got loose, you can tighten the nut up, or you can tighten the pommel up perhaps more easily. And I haven't actually tried that, but usually no, it doesn't move at all, because there's probably glue in there, epoxy. I just don't like the use of glue in hilts, because it means that when they do get loose, it makes them incredibly hard to tighten. So overall, to summarise, love the blade, only with that minor comment about the angles at the ricasso. I love the grip, only really with the minor comment of the wire is sticking out a bit spiky, and I can just see it there. I'm not a huge fan of the guard and pommel. While they are quite nice forms, they seem a little, certainly the guard seems a little bit on the big side. That might match the original, in which case that's fine, but I don't like the finish. I think if the finish was blackened, if the edges were a little bit more crisp and a little bit less rounded, and it wasn't this matte satin finish, if it was either shiny or blackened, then it would look way, way better. But overall, it's a lovely sword. I think for $500 it is worth it, and certainly if you want a performance cutting sword that handles right and weighs the right amount and has the right sort of rotation points and just feels correct in the hand, this is very, very good for a sharp cutting rapier. And there's not many choices out there for sharp cutting rapiers at all, until you really get, and there's not many choices at all, but really you can't get something to compare with this unless you go something semi-custom up to probably closer to $1,000 or above. So at $500, honestly, for a rapier, I think this is really, really good value. But before we close this down, let's do a little bit more cutting with this rapier and see if I get any more feedback from it. Start with just some simple cuts on some Coke bottles. So very clean cut, slightly scooped on my part, but very clean cut. And that, as you can see, the wet on the blade, maybe in the camera, is pretty much with the tip of the blade. Would you want a small cut like that across your forearm, thigh, neck, face? I think not. It doesn't need to be a body cleaving blow, certainly a very fight changing blow. I'm going to try a little snap cut from as far away as possible. There you go. Who says flick cuts don't work? They work great! A milk carton with little cuts. Thrusting. A false edge cut from the outside descending line. So water bottles are easy, particularly the milk ones. Let's see how it holds up against wood. This isn't so much a test of the wood, it's a test of the sword. Pretty clean. A little bit of a break on the side. There was a knot in the wood, but pretty damn clean. So that's a fairly sturdy stick actually, and it cut in, but it broke both sides, so it kind of snapped it rather than cutting it. Again, it started to cut and then snapped the rest. Pretty clean, snapped off a bit of that side, but quite clean apart from that. So to conclude, the Saxony rapier from Chen, obviously linked below. I think it's really, really good value for money. $500 for what's essentially a very good blade, very good edge geometry. That is a really fun sword to use. It's essentially analogous to a large military rapier. Okay, so it's not necessarily a typical rapier. It's more of a kind of cut and thrust or cutty rapier, if we call it that. It's a rather large hilt, it's a rather large blade, it's not particularly long, but it's a really good cutter, really, really fun to use. Very sharp out of the box. Criticisms. I don't like the finish of the hilt. I think the hilt's probably a little bit on the large side, and I don't like the fact that it's made of cast stainless steel. Just not my thing. I'm not really a fan of the hilt construction. I wish the tang was going all the way through with a visible peen or nut at the end that I could tighten. Particularly important because during cutting, the wobble or looseness in the hilt, don't know if you'll be able to hear that rattle, but it's now a little bit looser than it was before. Now, hilts get loose in use, that happens, we're used to it with fencing weapons, but we're used to being able to tighten them up. If this was a screwable pommel, or a pommel I could actually physically screw by hand and tighten up, that wouldn't be a problem. I could even dismount it, I could put a little leather washer in, I could solve the problem in any number of ways, but because I can't tighten this hilt easily myself, it's not possible for me to do it, and I would prefer it if the tang came through with a nut at the end and I could tighten it up. So the hilt is likely to get loose in cutting, to warn you of that. The grip is rather nice, the wire hasn't come loose, it's moving around a little bit but not very much. I don't know how durable this wire wrap will be with longer term usage, but that remains to be seen. There is a very slight set. I mean, it is really, really minimal. It's probably deviation of maybe 2mm from straight in the blade. And that was done during a previous cutting session. It is no worse and no better after this session, this test. And if I'd only done this test, that probably wouldn't have happened. I just had one particularly duff hit. Human error, but just to, you know, make it clear, this can happen to any steel blade. It doesn't matter how expensive or how good quality a tempered steel blade is, this can happen to any of them, and it's probably correctable. I just haven't bothered to do it yet, but it's so minimal, I'm sure it'll be correctable. So I think it's a great value package, but I think it could be improved, and what I'd ideally like to see is LK Chen actually do a second edition version of this that's slightly improved. Most importantly, I'd like to see the tang coming through to the end with a functional, rather than cast on the end, decorative nut on the end there. And I'd rather see the hilt in a different finish than it currently is, not this satin finish, either high polish or blackened. I think would look really, really cool and was quite popular on German rapiers. So there we go. I hope that's been a useful review of the Saxony rapier from LK Chen. Very good value for money for £500. I just think for no extra money they could make it even better. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will be again next time, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.